looks like uh, um, there's also another problem with writing literature and reading literature, especially. We, as a culture, as humanity, have produced so many books that we can't really read that all. And this is why Franco Moretti came up with the idea of distant reading to try to somehow cover this huge field uh, by uh, by other means than just reading, and especially the academic close reading kind of reading. Now, in other words, we're speaking here of two approaches. One can be, I mean, one of the stylometry might seem like it's the microscope of computational literary studies. Distant reading, on the other hand, can be symbolized by the telescope. I hope I'll be able to show you how we can put the microscope and the telescope together to look at things we call culture or texts or whatever. So let's do some defining. Stylometry is really easy. As you can see from the etymology of the word itself, it's counting whatever can be counted in text. Now, of course, you can count dead bodies or metaphors, but you can also count very frequent words or text lengths or something. Now, this sort of stylometry, especially the stylometry that I'm preaching here, the one based on most frequent words, is really useful, as I already said, in authorship attribution, but it's also helps in it finds different signals of other textual elements like chronology, like genre, sometimes, if you're lucky, even by sex or gender, whatever you decide to call it. In fact, the chronological approach is what gave birth to stylometry when Wincenty Lutosławski, the crazy Polish specialist on Plato, decided to count the stylistic features of Plato's dialogues and establish what I hear is a fairly sensible chronology of Platonic dialogues. Uh, and in fact, we stylometrists are closely and carefully approaching the idea that uh, what we do might actually have something to do with that uh, that huge, endless bag of various ideas that we call style. So these are the three things we certainly need to know, that we certainly need to establish when we start speaking of stylometry. Now, distant reading, as I've already said, and you probably know, uh, we have the distant reading is the brainchild of Franco Moretti, who was looking for ways to go beyond the very limited literary canon in uh, global literature, national literatures, etc., and try to catch glimpses of the literary field as a whole. Moretti started off with looking at what we call metadata, numbers of texts per year, per nation, the history of the printing of printing, various slightly more qualitative ways to look into, say, the narrative or the plot of the novels. And then he sort of naturally migrated into something uh, slowly migrated towards looking into purely or perhaps also linguistic elements of the literary text, and that's especially true of his disciple and collaborator Matt Jokers, who quite provocatively uh, takes from Moretti the fact that if we want to find new stuff about literature, then um, then we should certainly then we have to look at more text than we normally do. and that is, of course, a very anti-canonic approach to literature. I understand jokers would like to simply read everything. Now, distant reading has its critics. There is a beautifully entitled paper by Joanna Drucker, Why Distant Reading Isn't. I think that the title says more than the actual paper. And then there's also the point of view uh, mm, made quite vocal by my foe and friend Laura Mandel when she mentions that distant reading might be looking for, might in fact be strengthening stereotypes rather than overthrowing them. We quarrel all the time, but we also help each other in putting our citations up. So I think we're fine. Now, the most frequent word-based stylometry was introduced to the literary people with a famous book, Computation into Criticism, a study of Jane Austen's novels and an experimental method by this great gentleman sitting there in that picture, John Burroughs, God rest his soul, who, I mean, obviously linguists knew that. I mean, certainly we know about Zipf's law that says things like that. But what he what he pointed out back in 1987, that half of what we say or read or write, it consists of 100 very frequent words. And and obviously this is a material that is not traditionally studied by literary scholars, but perhaps it should, because it has a very good statistics, simply because there's so much of them. So how is it done? And you will have to, I will have to beg you for a suspension of disbelief for a while if you haven't seen those things before, because it does seem crazy sometimes. So, first of all, the approach in this most frequent word-based stylometry, the approach to language is we approach language as a bag of words. We get rid of the context of the sentence structure, of grammar, in a way, and we simply count words, hoping in this madness that the sheer statistics of the words will be enough to bring us interesting insights. Then, of course, we want to make a most frequent word list. We usually, for our studies, usually take between 100 and 2,000 of those most frequent words. We count them in each of the texts, and then we compare the text using a particular measure of difference. Actually, professionally, we call it a distance measure. Then we apply some other statistical tricks like cluster analysis. And finally, to make things even nicer and prettier and more visually attractive, we do network analysis. And this is how it's going to work. So I've originally planned, knowing whom I'll be talking to do my initial methodological example using Hebrew literature. But as you probably have guessed, I don't read Hebrew. I don't know much about especially new Hebrew literature. So I'm going to take it easy and do this on the ruling literature in the world today. But don't worry, there are some Hebrew examples coming. So I hope you'll forgive me. So now, first of all, we really need to know that the 100 most frequent words are really boring. Can you see them here? Nothing really to write home about. I mean, okay, so I mean, this particular 100 most frequent words, you will probably find them in whichever collection of texts they might have been taken from. This sort of suggests that, I mean, in the last line, towards the 100th position, we have both lady and sir. So that will suggest it's a literature from a time when people were still more or less civil to each other. Anyway, let me show you immediately what this is coming from. Now, the good news is, of course, we don't do this by hand anymore. Maciej Eder and Mike Estem and myself have written a package for R, which helps you do that very, very, very quickly. And by the way, if you ask us, we will come and teach you how to do that. Usually half an afternoon is enough, but we've been known to produce 10-day workshops as well. Depends on what you want. Now, and don't worry, it actually has a graphic user interface, so you can use it and click with your mouse like a normal person instead of inputting comments like a geek. I hope you can appreciate that. So let's do a little simulated authorship attribution in English literature. And I'm going to spoil my point a little because I guess, well, especially the English-born part of the audience have already recognized the 5 books, right? Somebody, please say something.
Hello.
Oh, something.
Okay. If not even the first one. Anyway, so thank you. See, we don't need our stupid software. So let me show what the stupid software does. Okay, so first of all, as I said, we destroy the structure and all the words fall into a big bag, and out comes a frequency list. And as you can see, they're very boring words. Of course, it's not, I can't even show you the 100 most frequent words here. They're way down. I'm on the 4th floor. I think that my list is going way down into the cellars of my old house in Krakow. And then what we do, we take those words, so those texts again, and then we simply count all those, the frequency of all those frequent words in each of the texts. And we arrive at the absolutely sensational news that to write Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen had to take exactly 4,330 of these and a little more than 3,500 ands, etc., etc., and there she has it. So this is not very useful, unless, of course, you want to learn that by heart and impress your friends at parties. But when you apply a simple distance measure like this one, this is a cosine. This is what the most fashionable that we use now. It's called cosine delta. It gives you the cosine gives you the size of the angle between two frequency vectors, and it's all very easy. And of course, it's really easy because our software does that without you knowing how to count this stuff. And then we get those distance measures, and I would like you to focus on those measures of distance, in other words, measures of difference. Each of the numbers says at the intersection of rows and columns tells us the degree of difference between each pair of texts. And to make things easy, I've colored in red the smallest values. Have you perhaps noticed an interesting thing?
They do not appear for the same person. They are running from top end to down below.
Yeah, it's a diagonal.
Yeah.
It's a diagonal.
No, well, yeah, the diagonal is just is just a simple result of the order of my authors by alphabet. Obviously, here we have shortened titles, but say let's look at that famous book Pride and Prejudice, the second column with numbers. The two red distance measures, as you can see, they've been marked in red because they are very small. They are smaller than all the other ones. Now they come at intersections with Emma and sense, which must be sense and sensibility. Wait a minute, who wrote that? The same person who wrote Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen. Wait a minute. Would that work uh, for Dickens as well? David Copperfield is has the smallest distance from Bleak House and Hard Times. Do you see what's going on? And this is true of all those red colored numbers. The distance, the difference between the usage of the very frequent words in text by the same authors is smaller, significantly smaller, from those in text by different authors. And this, I'm sorry to say, is a law of nature. If it does not work, then something really interesting is going on. Now, of course, as you might have noticed, this is not something we usually go out and show our friends, the traditional literary scholars, much. But if you do cluster analysis, it will put texts that have the smallest degree of difference of distance uh, on the neighboring branches of this beautiful cluster analysis tree. Of course, it's a horizontal tree, it's a fallen tree, but you know what's going on. And of course, here we can see that texts by the same authors usually stick together. In other words, the way to read this is taking from the top. Uh, the the text that is most similar in terms of the usage of the most frequent words is Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and Austen's Sense and Sensibility, and the next most similar one is her Emma. Then when we go to the slightly bigger branch below, we get Tom Jones and Joseph Andrews by Fielding. And then as we continue down this tree, we can observe that to our methods, Sterne is Sterne, and Dickens is Dickens, and George Eliot is George Eliot, etc. There is, however, one exception from this rule. Can you see it?
Wuthering Heights. Bront.
Well, yes, but that's because the poor thing, she only wrote a single novel and then she died. By the way, let me point out the fact that the three closest books to Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights are the three novels by Charlotte Bronte. But, you know, they were born in the same house, started writing together, etc. No, there's an even, how should I put
Fielding,
it?
There's
Fielding,
Fielding.
Shamela is
Fielding.
Yes,
the difference.
Shyamalan.
Yes, he is
And you know what?
first
And
with
you know
Jane
what that
Austen
is?
and then with the Brontes, one of the Brontes. Yeah.
Yes, but the way we read it, Fielding's Shamala is closest to the two books by Richardson, right? Pamela and Clarissa. You know why? Because Shamala is a wicked, malicious parody by Fielding of poor Richardson's Pamela. Also, because it's a parody of an epistolary novel, it's also an epistolary novel. In other words, either uh, Fielding counted very frequent words in Richardson, or he was a really good parodist. Now, as you can see at the bottom of this diagram, this was done for 100 most frequent words. But if we want, you can do it for 200. Why not? Apart from the immaterial sequence of the big branches, nothing really happens, except that now we have all the 3 Bronte sisters hanging from the same common branch, which is quite interesting. Fielding's Shyamala still seems more like Richardson than Fielding, which again makes Fielding a good parodist. Uh, and then we get a similar thing for 500 most frequent words. Now, of course, one question is, so which of those slightly differing diagrams do we take as the best one? Usually, especially if we're doing authorship attribution, you want to combine the results of as many as possible. And that's another, we call that a bootstrap consensus tree, where the results of the nearest neighbor associations are brought together. And here we again see a separate branch for the Bronte sisters. We have a strong Victorian branch of Dickens plus Eliot. And we now have, if you want, Fielding's Shyamala parody, exactly where we want it, right in the middle between Fielding's other writing and Richardson. So, and now, while this is an interesting and useful way of presenting our results when we're dealing, especially when we're looking for authorship attribution, obviously, if any of those texts were anonymous, it would give us very nicely the correct result, obviously, by placing it in the little branch containing the suspected, the real author. Now, for a more detailed view, we can also use network analysis, which is a beautifully simple way of visualizing similarities between data points based on very intricate mathematics. And the result for our little diagram will be like that. And here, I mean, visually, this again is based on the results of the previous analysis. Here, it sort of helps you organize the results, or if you want, even the data. The closer two texts are, two data points are, and the thicker is the line that joins them, the more similar they are, because there is a gravitational algorithm working on all of them. It gives us quite a nice thing, which shows us the great strength of the authorial signal, but it also gives us slightly smaller, but perhaps even more interesting degrees of similarity between texts by different authors. Okay, if you've swallowed that, then and if you apply that to, say, someone like Dickens, who wrote a lot of stuff, you can observe how beautifully stylometry by most frequent words addresses chronology. Here, Dickens changes color from early green to later yellow and red and finally purple. And it's almost like we're dealing with the traditional literary historical division of Dickens into 4 different literary periods. Now, in translation, however, things get a little more complicated, because I mean all the possible problems are listed here. What is it that we're going to see in terms of the usage of the most frequent words? Because of course we have to, first of all, remember the discussion on the translator's invisibility started by Lawrence Venuti, himself a translator, also a victim of mine. He wasn't very thrilled when I showed him what happens to his own translations of Italian literature into English. That was really funny. Because since we're dealing with very frequent words, I'm giving you an example I can follow between English and German. Obviously, there is no one-on-one relationship between very frequent words in two languages, even in languages that belong to the same family of languages. I mean, with my native Polish, that'll be even wider. So in other words, the question is there at all anything we can call a stylometric translator's invisibility or visibility? So let's go into that. Oh, well, so this is where I have to say, God bless benyehuda.org, because this is where I got all this stuff. Now, once again, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I hope you do, and you will perhaps help me interpret those diagrams. And soon you will also see why I chose the particular authors here. Here, of course, it's just uh, a superstitious trial whether our methods work for Hebrew, but we know they do because we tried many years ago already. So here I have three Hebrew writers, and I chose them because they're also translators, and that's what I want to talk about. And here, I mean, the result of this bootstrap consensus tree analysis is that Shoshana Shira is Shoshana Shira, uh, and that the two other translators, Ben Eliezer and Ophir, I mean, when they write their own stuff, because they're all just Hebrew originals, they have their own authorial thumbprint, and it's pretty easy to tell one from another. So, but now let's crank it up a notch, and let's throw out. Sorry, that's just a following network analysis, still just their Hebrew originals. But let's now crank things up a notch and see what happens when we add their translations. And that's where it gets interesting. Now, contrary to what you might think, these are not two different diagrams. They are the same networks. Sometimes some parts of the corpus might not be connected at all. Such great is the difference between them. So let's try to analyze that a bit, as far as I can say. So Shoshana Shira is very much herself. Whether she writes her own stuff, these are the three texts I've already shown you on the previous slide. But then she also translated, yes, of course, Pride and Prejudice. And we have to say that she is very much herself when she translates Austen. Now, when we speak of Ben Eliezer, his translation of Robert Louis Stevenson's book and of Joseph Conrad's Youth is quite similar to three of his own writings, but his translation of Dickens's Curiosity Shop is much closer to the original writings by Ophik, forgot his first name, of course, but also Ophik's translation of the famous Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, which sort of shows you that if we're looking for some sort of translation, stylometric translational universals, it's sort of doesn't seem to be working, because some translators behave in a slightly different way from some others, and as can be seen by Ben Eliezer's behavior here, that doesn't he doesn't seem to be doing the same thing. I mean, when he translates Stevenson and Conrad, he's like his own writing, but his Curiosity Shop by Dickens is very different. So I guess, is that bad news? Is that good news? Let's see what happens in my experiment 3. Okay, that's simple. Obviously, these are just the English originals of a couple of books, and I mean, again, the pervading strength of the authorial signal is quite visible here, although I'm quite fascinated, saw that for the first time, the strong similarity between the language of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and Conrad's Youth. Here's a PhD thesis right there. I mean, a traditional one. So now let's look what happens when we take the Hebrew translations of those texts, and that becomes once again sort of a mess. Now, however, even in the mess, you have to admire the extent to which admire or fear the extent to which the authorial signal seems to be preserved. I mean, Stevenson, the black a cluster, we call it a community in network analysis, by Stevenson is pretty obvious, but then we cannot ignore the fact that we have Ben Eliezer here as the translator, so it might be a mixture of actually both. We have of course, some of the translators only appear only once, like Markson here, whose Prince and the Pauper by Twain gravitates strongly towards another Twain, and also his translation of the Pickwick Papers. That's another interesting thing. And but then we also have to say that the translatorial signal of someone like Ben Eliezer is not entirely preserved, because his Dickens is very different from his Stevenson, which is probably a good thing for Ben Eliezer, whoever he is. At least it looks like he is pretty good at finding different voices for two different writers. Good for him. Okay. I think we can move on to the next thing. And now, another case, a single writer and translations by his many Hebrew authors. Of course, I'm dealing, the translations here are of the Polish of Janusz Korczak, probably one of the noblest persons I've ever heard of. And here we can see that his translations by Arad, these are the ones in blue, they show that Arad has quite his distinct Korczak voice. That the translations by Sadan are much more varied because the yellow extends over a much greater distance in this diagram, and that the three translations by Meltzer differ very much. But as far as I know, my Korczak, I think we're also dealing with differences of genre, which may come in and spoil our view of the translational signal. So as you can see, there are what we see here is this sort of strength of the authorial signal that survives that survives translation into a very different language, but also within the authorial signal in translation, we also see the signal of the translator. So I guess Venuti should be happy after all, because the translators are somewhat visible, but not as visible as the author. Sort of makes sense. Not that I know exactly why it's happening, but the empirical evidence is pretty overwhelming. Okay, I have 20 more minutes. Okay, one more thing. We also can, if we want, look into a single text that was written or translated by two different persons. Here we have one text by Korczak translated from the Polish by two translators. And what we see here is simply the development of the text from the first word at 0 until the end, as our horizontal axis goes to the right. And it looks like Arad and Sadan, I'm probably butchering the accent in those two names. Forgive me. It looks like they more or less equally shared uh, that text. It looks like Arad was responsible. The bigger red, the bigger red part of the diagram here seems to be showing that Arad simply translated one half and Saddam translated the other. But again, somebody who reads Hebrew should now.
It probably says
Uh,
that.
Could you repeat that? Could you say that again, please?
I think it was just he was just unmuted.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Fine. So now, remember I promised you to combine the microscope with the telescope. So now let's try to put together distant reading and stylometry, and try to see what happens when we combine the two methods and use stylometry, but also simple semantics and metadata analysis together with stylometry. And this time we're switching into my native Polish literature, and I'm going to boast of the 10,000 full book text corpus that we have put together. We really had to do it because nobody did that before. Also, we decided to make it half originals, half translations into Polish, because that doesn't very often happen in national corpora. There's already enough indirect sources that we could use. Some of them are very good, and some of them are very bad, and even some of them are very illegal. And it's the biggest thing that we have in Polish so far. Of course, you can't really compare it to the national corpus of the Polish language because it's for entirely different research. But still, I mean, we do have a lot of texts, and we are doing this thanks to my university's flagship project called Digital Humanities Lab. But of course, it all started with the lockdown. Oh, the lockdown was great. It was very conducive to uh, this very repetitive task of gathering text from all over the internet and other sources. So let's look at the numbers of, and I'm boasting here. So these are the number of texts in prose, poetry, and drama, and the proportion between original Polish and translated into Polish. Here it's even more boastful. I just want to show you that we have more than 500 million words in this corpus, and here's our data for the number of authors, translators, and also our 25 source languages. Of course, you know, some languages, in terms of cultural studies, some languages are more equal than others. We'll soon see how that works in this collection. Now, just to spoil the whole effect, you have to, I mean, you probably have noticed that 10,000 texts seems a lot, and it certainly seems a lot to my poor laptop, which I had to exchange for a mainframe computer at the computer center, at the computing center of my university to work on that. But from another point of view, 10,000 books in Polish, it's nothing. 10,000 books is what corresponds to the number of new titles, both original and translated, that appear in our little country of 40 million people, not even that, over, say, 3 years. So it's not really catching up with anything. Still, it's a nice, biggish sample, and again, the biggest I've heard of that we have. But let's not get too excited about that. So here's my diagram that shows you the number of texts from the particular decades, and the proportion between originals and translations. and the amazing dominance of translations is something that becomes equally obvious when you enter any Polish bookstore. You know, bookstores, those places where you actually buy books in paper. Some of you might still remember them. Now, of course, while as we hope that this is somehow a representative sample, it's interesting to look at the last 200 years of writing in Polish to compare the numbers of translations from various languages. And in fact, the first thing we've discovered is that contrarily to earlier literature, which pointed to the 1920s and the 1930s as the time when English literature becomes the hegemon in translation. You can actually see that this is not simply true. But then there are interesting little things like when you look at the 1970s. There is a sudden influence of translations from the Hungarian. That's their big red thing. And that, perhaps less surprisingly, in the 1940s, obviously mostly after especially that's probably is looking mostly at the 5 years between the end of World War II and the end of the beginning of the 1950s. Suddenly, we have a huge influx of translations from the Russian. But then, if I
May
may
I
say
ask a
so.
question?
Yes, please.
Very simple one, because this is the representation of those texts within the corpus, but you didn't say how
Yes,
the corpus is representative for all the body of literature from this period.
absolutely. Absolutely. It's a problem that we're dealing with, but don't worry. The same flagship project has now obtained about 500,000 of bibliographic data of all translations available in Poland's biggest national library, and we'll be going into that, and then we will know how representative this corpus is. I will be very happy to discuss this a little later, because obviously we are very aware that there have been several filters into that produce the combination of those of the text that we have in the 10,000 corpus. Okay.
Thank you.
So, uh, uh, yeah, then one interesting thing is, and I think this is true of most literatures, look how gradually look how gradually the time between the original of a foreign work and the translation into Polish was going in a decreasing trend. It's almost as if a national literature first, as it appears, first starts catching up the old classics, and then it can deal with more and more modern contemporary writing. Here's the proportions of authorial sex. I'm call it sex because it's obviously binary here, because we don't have any gender data, do we? So while authorship is still dominated by males, the proportion is becoming more and more balanced. Much less in original authors translated into Polish, and you can see on the other hand that the profession of the literary translator has been quite balanced in terms of sex, starting in the 1940s at least, and so that's an interesting difference. Now, if we want to talk of gender, I always say there's 4 genders in literary translation, and these are the proportions between from left to right: women translating women, men translating women, women translating men, and men translating men. You can see that usually it's the most frequently relatively women mostly translate women, men mostly translate men, but relatively again, more women translate men than men translate women. Why ever that happens, I don't know, except that it's actually true of my past literary translator career. Basically the same thing. Now, of course, because we can find any words we want in our big collection of texts, first of all, our metadata gives us the major places of publication of Polish texts, obviously extending way beyond the present borders of Poland. But if you want, we can look into the literary text, and these are now the proportions. Of course, the bigger, the more frequent the use of some of place names in original Polish texts. And of course, when we look at German text, it's going to travel west and even further west when we travel to, say, English literature. But it's sort of interesting that London has such a huge domination in literature translated from the English. That is, of course, literature translated from English literature, simply English literature. In comparison, excuse me, wrong. In comparison, German literature seems to be much more cosmopolitan. Look how important Paris and Rome are as compared to their relative importance in English texts. And of course, there's something called sentiment analysis, where we can compare, where we can try to see whether Polish literature, that is originals, are happier or sadder than literature translated from other literatures. This is actually already based on a large language model, so the results are pretty solid here. And it's interesting to see that while, say, Polish Romanticism seems sadder than its translated foreign counterparts, there comes a sudden change somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, and here the optimistic terms, terms associated with positive feelings, start growing pretty quickly. And by the time of Poland's regaining independence, they're more or less reaching the level of optimism exhibited by translated literature. And in fact, the time when this increase starts is perhaps very aptly called in Polish literary history positivism, of course, for very different reasons, but it's sort of a nice coincidence. Now, just to make things a little nicer at the end, this is when I'm going to finally put together stylometry and distant reading. And if you remember those networks that I showed you of, say, Dickens and that English corpus, and of course the examples from Hebrew literature and the translations, well, this is the same thing applied in a slightly different graphic way to this entire 10,000 strong corpus of literature in Polish. And as you can see here, there are patches of color. Of course, color represents various categories of this writing in Polish, and those patches of color, each the ball here represents a different book. They tend to sort of stick together in a logical way, and let's just push it onto a two-dimensional network, which is much easier to interpret and to show. As you can see, first there is a sort of a bottom left to top right movement of original Polish writings, and then we have a separate signal of genre with the light blue drama, and that's how we spell Shakespeare in Polish, as as it should be, and then we observe that text translated from other literatures to a large extent like to stick together, and also some of them depart quite far from the original Polish writings. And if this is not an excellent visualization of the phenomenon of translationese, then I don't know what is. Okay, I'm coming to the end of my time, so I'm going to spare you some of the other stuff. And let's now come to my so what session. So at least I seem to be convinced that it actually makes sense to combine counting very frequent words and counting metadata with some semantics as well. That, well, here again, suspension of disbelief, please. The 10,000 corpus is behaving very much in the same way when I started this with just 500 texts. The phenomena that I observe are pretty consistent. It's just that the representation is better, but of course not ideal. That there's quite a number of things that makes us nod because we sort of expect that due to traditional knowledge of literary history. But then that this quantitative approach can indicate that perhaps we should look at some phenomena one more time, and this target language specific translation is quite obvious. And if you look at if you look at that big network of mine that I've just shown you, I think Itamar Ibn Zohar would really like it as at least a metaphorical illustration of his polysystemic theory of translation. And with a smiling Ibn Zohar, this is where I'm going to end, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting lecture, and we really appreciate the usage of Hebrew literature as well. Even though you're not a Hebrew scholar, we really appreciate this gesture for us. Okay, so now we can start our Q&A session. So you can ask questions by raising your hand or by writing in the chat, and please, Professor Rybicki, answer right away. So, okay, we have first question from Daniel, please.
Thank you very much. Rather at the beginning about the parody. I think it was Richardson who was else.
By
Other stuff. Stop words
exactly,
in a
yes.
parody. I mean, I would
A lot of
understand that you
computation.
would have such a similarity in content words, but on stop words.
Well, I mean, there it is. I'd love to know. I don't understand this. It's the only way we can explain this is that the huge statistics of the stop words, as we call them, actually reflects deeper elements of style. I'm doing inverted commas here. I try to be very careful not to say stylometry equals style, because style is much more than this. But apparently that's now obviously in the case of Shyamala, it follows the epistolary form. And obviously, there are very frequent words that will appear in epistolary novels, the first and second person pronouns, examples of that. But it's not all. We actually can get rid of pronouns from our analysis, and it still works. So it's not just the pronouns. Yes, it's.
Thank you.
So
Okay.
I travel the world trying to find someone who would actually explain why we see all this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Katya, please.
I can see.
Yeah, thank you a lot for its amazing lecture. I enjoyed it a lot and learned a lot. I have two questions. But the both of them are like from the person who knows nothing about analyzing literary text in this manner. So the first one is, how do you deal with different languages? I mean, for example, in English, the words don't change a lot. So in Polish or like in Russian, the words do. So how do you deal with that? And the second question is, what do you do about the text written, like, for example, if I write in English, which isn't my native language, I obviously do it slightly different than the native speakers. So how do you deal with the text written by someone in a foreign language? I mean, taking into consideration like possible mistakes, like misusage of articles, for example, or other stuff. So yeah, thank you.
So the first question is about once again
Different types of languages where words change or change not so much.
The flexive versus inflexive language.
Right. That's the terms I was missing.
There it is. So at the very big, I had a paper written with Maciej Edert on that when we tried to compare various literatures, and we noticed that there is not a lot of difference. That this is also why we have empirically, together with all the other members of the stylometric mafia, there is a stylometric mafia in the world. You might not know it, but there is. That's how we sort of arrive at, once you're between 100 and 2,000 most frequent words in your as the word list you're using, it doesn't really matter whether a language is flexive or not. We actually notice that cultural differences, say the degree of cultural variety, the number of schools, different schools of writing in a given national literature, that's more important than the flexiveness or the inflexiveness of a given language. But we're still looking into this. This is very much something we would like to know. We don't know enough. Of course, we know that the first 100, say the most frequent 500 word list in English will be composed mostly of, well, would have a huge representation of modal verbs, because they are very much they account for much of the very frequent words. In languages like Polish, where the grammatical information goes into the individual verbs as they're being flexed, somebody must know the correct word, then obviously there are not as many modals in the Polish most frequent word list. But apparently, what really counts is not whether it's a preposition or a pronoun or a modal or any other function word. It's just that it has to be one of the very frequent words because of the huge statistics.
Okay.
The second question was, yes, that is an interesting. Now I've never done this on say English as a native language versus English as a wait, in a way I have. Oh, thank you for reminding me this. Joseph Conrad, right? Not a native English speaker. Actually, he learned 4 other languages before he started speaking English or learning English, and he learned it at a ridiculously late age of 20 something. Now, when you make when you sort of take, say, 1,000 of novels in English, and they also represent in this in a network analysis a movement from one side of the diagram to another. It's nicely ordered. There's a nice chronological evolution, understandable in the even in the usage of most frequent words in the language. Conrad's English is going against the grain. It's like he's learning to use the very frequent words more like a British person throughout his writing career. So, yes, thank you for reminding me. We should write a paper on this.
Yeah, because it's really an interesting topic, especially in our world when many of us
It's
write
also
English, not
interesting
being
with
native
Nabokov.
speakers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. You saw another hand, but now I frightened you off.
It was yeah. So okay, Daniel, go on.
I got another question. Yeah, have you done this on a lower granularity? For example, have you taken one of the plays and done stylometrics on different authors, whether they use different language in the mouth of different speakers? Or you can do this obviously also in novels. You could do this on anthologies. I assume you have
Daniel,
played with this.
I love the way you think, because not only we do it in drama and we see differences, but our guru, John Burroughs, his 1987 book, what compared the idiolects, as he called them, of different Jane Austen characters. He made his doctoral students weed out the dialogue from the novels, and then divide the dialogue into each character's parts. And for instance, he could show us that similar characters in the different novels speak similarly. So the main intelligent sister in Pride and Prejudice speaks very much like the most important and intelligent sister in Sense and Sensibility. The other sister speaks like the other sister in the other book, and the same is true of the male protagonists. And there are clear male versus female differences as well. So this has been studied in drama, but also in that first, like the foundational book of our mafia, the Burroughs book of 1987. So that's exactly what happens. Yeah.
But
I
do
also
you do
did
this
that for
also one
Sienkiewicz.
level higher? Do you do this also one level higher in order to study, let's say, the quality of an author's style, to be able to diversify the talk, so to compare the different styles in Jane Austen with the different styles in Dickens?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. It's just here, our methods are really good at showing differences, because irrespective of how big or small those differences are. It's like I remember how I mentioned that one of the Hebrew translators seems to be really good at splitting his voices according to the text he translated. Well, it's at a different scale. This is what we can do also to compare that. And again, if it was a really straightforward and obvious thing to say, aha, this author does a better differentiation, say, between hero and villain, male and female, and we could say, aha, so perhaps he or she is a better writer. I'm usually a little wary of those things, but yes, this is done. This can be done.
Okay, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to follow on my comment when you were presenting this data on juxtaposing the variety of databases, because what you are bringing is a very impressive corpus, but this can be, I believe, quite reasonably compared just to the national bibliography, right? This covering both original and translated texts, and which establishes essential proportions. And this would tell us how representative the corpus you have is for different periods and different categories, different translations. And
Absolutely.
are you
Absolutely.
are you approaching this issue from the side?
Yeah. So we're the way what we're doing is we're as I already mentioned. Yes. We are in cahoots with the National Library in Warsaw, and they've given us their entire catalog of anything they have in their catalogs that have been translated into Polish from any language, both fiction and scientific writing, anything. And we are now slowly digging through this, hoping that that we can and of course the establishing how representative this corpus is, it's a sort of a side effect. We're really interested in counting those numbers on much more extensive metadata, even if it might or might not tell us how representative this corpus is. Once again, I know exactly how not representative this this corpus is for two reasons. One is it's just 10,000 texts, and 10,000 books is what we get every third, fourth year in Poland. So there's a lot of catching up to do, and actually catching up is impossible. And then I know exactly what the filters were. I mean, for a text to become part of the 10,005 corpus, I mean, it first had to be printed. A foreign book had to be translated. It had to be important enough also to be digitized. So now, while the Polish wiki sources are doing an absolutely brilliant job in this respect, as you can see, there's still a lot of filters that many texts that we might find or that we might not find in the digital version simply could not make. But,
Yeah, but
do I feel that you have a better suggestion for me?
No, I'm just saying what you are saying about non-representativeness is very true for contemporary production. But for 18th century or 17th century, first of all, there's no copyright issues and there's no problem to scanning those books. And also, several hundred books is already very representative corpus. So that's my question, saying it might be totally unrepresentative for the 21st century, but it might be very representative for early periods. And that's why I'm suggesting comparing it to national bibliographies, not to the library collection, but actually taking a Stryker, which has actually ready descriptions of individual books and gives you.
Oh, you mean the Stryker bibliography?
Exactly, bibliography, not the library.
Well, I don't want to go into personal things, but that's what we hoped.
Yeah,
that's what we hoped, and it's been and we've been prevented. I don't want to go into this.
Okay.
It's a very sad story. But by the way, I've been using the Stryker bibliography to check the data, the metadata for much of the 19th century stuff here. Absolutely, yeah.
Do we have another questions? Because if not, I also do have some questions. So maybe I will give my first of all, I find it really fascinating that Bronze sisters were so close to each other when it comes to style. And
if what I show is style,
okay, like the frequency of the usage of the most frequent words. Okay, to be precise. Yeah, I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that, because actually I was reading something about the usage of stylometry in psychology, and I came across the article when it turned out that the people that are in a close relationship tend to use the stop words in a very similar manner. And it actually it's very interesting, because do you maybe know if the style is unchanging on, can we trace maybe the change in the personal, okay, maybe not style, the usage of frequent words, you know, in the course of the lifetime? Because you've mentioned the case of Joseph Conrad, that he changed like his
yes. Now,
words.
most authors, especially those who wrote a lot over a number of years, they tend to have an evolution. It's also so regular in Conrad that you can actually see where he lied about the dates when he wrote something. He has long tried to make everyone believe that his story, The Black Maid, which was eventually published, I think, in the first or the second even decade of the 20th century, was actually written 10 years before he started writing all his stuff. Neither always believed he was lying, and Stylometry confirms neither.
Okay, but we call that footprint, so it is actually not exactly the footprint, because
now
it
coming back to your question,
yeah,
the Bronte sisters, of course, this is connected with the story of, I mean, you know, they started writing under male pseudonyms, and some people suspected it was their brother Patrick who wrote all this stuff and simply shared it out among his sisters. But Patrick was a drunk. I don't think he could do it. And also, when you compare the scale of the differences between the three Bronte sisters, I mean, they are different writers. When you put them in the company of other authors, they do stick together. But if you just take the three of them, they go out into three different places. So also, I mean, so any similarity might be also perhaps associated with, there are some ideas that Charlotte, the one who survived the longest, might have been editing later versions of her sister's work, but even that is not sort of a necessary thing. Now we have to make a strong distinction between literary language and the language we use in our life, because unless we take on the obsolete romantic idea of authorship, I mean, writers create their own language and their reality, which might be very different from their personal idiolects. And paradoxically, perhaps it's easier to detect differences between the most frequent word differences in text by different authors, literary text, than between their speech. So it's actually two different things. There is a book by James Pennebaker, The Secret Life of Pronouns, written like 10 years ago, perhaps even more, where he analyzes the usage of languages in families, but also in other closed communities, and there people speak similarly if they are locked up in the same prison or school or convent. But these differences are not always observed between writers of fiction. So there is a slight difference. I've also seen results of psychiatric studies, and yes, bipolars tend to have very different usages of very frequent words, not just meaningful words, not just sentiment analysis, but also those very frequent words, depending on which phase, whether they're up or down. So it's all so there is this some different phenomena occur when we speak of language as it is used every day, and when it is being molded in an artistic way.
Yes, but I also saw the article about the letters between Jung and Freud. And also,
yeah.
yes, in the context of most frequent words, I don't remember it was most frequent words or stop words now, but also it proved like the similarity in this most frequent words were present during the time when they're cooperating together, or the ideas were similar to each other. But when, you know, Jung like went his own way, the usage of frequent words was, you know, completely different in letters. So that's also very interesting, right? That we can somehow correspond with other person, like subconsciously.
Yeah, I mean, the sky's the limit in this sort of research. I'd love to go into all those ways, and thank God the gospel of stylometry is different ways. I mean, we now try to compare artificial intelligence writing and people writing. I've recently compared translations done by literary translations done by humans and by machines. And let me tell you, DeepL and Google Translate now use most frequent words very much like us humans. You have to use other methods
So,
to tell machines from humans.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay, you also mentioned Stylo R and how difficult it is to learn how to use it, or maybe not so difficult.
It's simple.
But I saw that there is a stylometry tool in the Polish Clarin website. Is it based on Stylo R? And because it's like super simple to use it, you just need to upload the text and, you know, like just adjust it to your needs.
It's been actually Maciej Eder collaborated with the production of, it's called Websty, I think. Okay, between you and me and the door, it hasn't really worked well because they could not assign as much processing power to it as they should. So while it shows a potential, right now I mean, we don't really use it. We prefer to use R, even if we have to use it. Well, also, I mean, we use Python more and more, but Stylo is nice because it sort of has become sort of a standard now. So because it's, again, something pretty easy to learn, and it does. I mean, take the example of this first initial English corpus. Since I have the text ordered as they should be, a single analysis is more or less. I mean, it reads all the text, separates them into words, counts them, applies cluster analysis and all that, and draws a nice diagram. For that number of text, 28, something like 15 seconds. So, you know, it's, as long as you have the text, it's over there. So if anybody would like to learn that, give me a call, just whistle.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Do you have another questions or comments? Okay, I don't see any, so I would like to thank you again for your very interesting lecture and very interesting analysis of literature, Hebrew, English, and Polish. Also to all of you, we would like to, as a digital forum, invite you for our subsequent jour fixe sessions. If you subscribe to our newsletter, you will receive the information straight to your email box. But if not, just follow Newsflash on EAJS, and you will be notified about all of that. So thank you again, Professor Rybicki. It was a pleasure to host you today.